morning, sir, and our fellow student. We are BSIT-1F, presenting Module 3 in Nstp, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Disaster Management. Topic 1. Overview of the Philippines Disaster Management System. Since the Office of the Civil Defense and National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council's creation, PD 1566 of 1978, has been the basic law that guides the disaster management programs, project, and strategies implementation in the country. However, it has been observed and noted from past experiences, combined with lessons learned and gaps examinations, that the law that creates the councils is more leaning and gives more emphasis on response actions, thus making the implementers reactive to possible disasters rather than taking a proactive stance in disaster risk management. Recently, OCD and DCC, Office of Civil Defense National Disaster Coordinating Council, initiated the shift of disaster management approaches and strategies from reactive to proactive, from disaster response and preparedness to disaster risk reduction management. A paradigm shift from the prevalent culture of reaction to a culture of prevention. Then, President Arroyo signed on May 17 Republic Act 10121, also known as the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. This act provides for the development of policies and plans and the implementation of actions and measures pertaining to all aspects of disaster risk reductions, management and recovery, including good governance, risk assessment and early warning, knowledge building, and awareness raising, reducing underlying risk factors, and preparedness for effective response and early recovery. The new law adapts and adheres to principles and strategies consistent with the international standards set by the Hague Framework for Action, HFA, a comprehensive, action-oriented response to international concern about the growing impacts of disaster on individual, communities, and national development. A national disaster risk reduction, management and recovery framework and plan was developed, formulated, and implemented. The framework provides for comprehensive, all-hazards, multi-sectoral, interagency, and community-based approach to disaster risk reduction management and recovery. It serves as the principal guide to disaster risk reduction, management, and recovery efforts in the country in conformity with the National Disaster Risk Reduction, Management and Recovery Framework, NDRRMRF. Republic Act No. 10121, known as the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management, PDRRM, Act 2010. In Act strengthening the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management System, providing for the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Framework and institutionalizing the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, appropriating funds, therefore, and for other purposes. Section 2, Declaration of Policy. 1. Upholding people's rights to life and property and adherence to internationally accepted principles, norms, and standards for capacity building in DRRM, humanitarian assistance. 2. Adoption of a holistic, comprehensive, integrated, proactive, and multi-sector approach in addressing the impacts of disasters, including climate change. 3. Development, promotion, and implementation of a comprehensive National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, NDRRMP. 4. Mainstreaming DRR and climate change in national and local development plans and development process. Policy formulation, socio-economic development planning, budgeting and governance. 5. Mainstreaming DRR into the peace process and conflict resolution. 6. Ensuring DRR and CC gender responsive measure, sensitive to indigenous knowledge and respect of human rights. 7. Strengthening capacity building of local government units on DRR. Decentralized powers, responsibilities, resources, and vulnerable and marginalized groups. 8. Engaging the participation of civil society, organization, or CSO, private sectors, and volunteers in DRR. 9. Promotion of breastfeeding before and during a disaster or emergency. 10. Ensuring maximum care, assistance, and services to affected individuals and families.
Salient feature of PDRRM Act of 2010. Number 1. Policy statements and terminologies on DRRM. Number 2. Institutional mechanisms. Sections 5 to 12. A. DRRMC's national, regional, provincial, city, and municipal levels and barangay development council at the barangay level. B. Office of the Civil Defense. C. Permanent Office on DRRM at the LGU level, Barangay DRRM Committee. D. Disaster Volunteers. Number 3. Operational Mechanisms. Sections 15 to 18. A. Coordination during emergencies. B. The declaration of state of calamity. C. Remedial measures. D. Mechanisms for the international humanitarian assistance network. Number 4. Participation, accreditation, mobilization, protection, and development of disaster volunteers. Training and education in DRR. A. Establishment of DRRM training institutes. B. Mandatory training in DRRM for public sector employees. C. Integration of DRR in school, training for out-of-school youth, sangguniang kabataan, and informal training. The National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, or NDRRMC, leading the collaborative efforts in disaster preparedness planning and mitigation, as well as disaster response operation and rehabilitation both in the government and the private sector of NDRRMC. It is the highest policy-making, coordinating, and supervising body at the national level, chaired by the Secretary of National Defense through the Executive Director of the Office of Civil Defense, OCD, and has 14 departments and 39 lines agencies as members. The NDRRMC is also responsible for advising the President of the Republic of the Philippines on the status of the National Disaster Preparedness Program and management plans, disaster operations, and rehabilitation efforts of all stakeholders. It also recommends to the President the declaration of the state of calamity and the release of the National Calamity Fund as needed. The Office of Civil Defense, OCD. The Office of Civil Defense, as the implementing arm of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, shall have the primary mission of administering a comprehensive national civil defense and disaster risk reduction and management program by providing leadership in the continuous development of strategic and systematic approaches, as well as measures to reduce the vulnerabilities and risk to hazard and manage the consequence of disasters. Its mission is to provide leadership and administration of a comprehensive national civil defense and disaster reduction and management program. The vision is to become center of excellence in disaster risk reduction and management by 2020.
The Philippine Disaster Management System, or PDMS, as embodied in Philippine Disaster 1566 and Republic Act 10121, is carried out at the various political subdivision and administrative regions of the country. Through the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, or NDRRMC, There are 17 Regional Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Councils, or RDDRMC, 80 Provincial Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Councils, or PDDRMC, 113 City Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, or CDDRMC, 1,496 Municipal Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, or MDRRMC, and 41,956 Barangay Risk Reduction and Management Councils, or BBRMC, respectively. Local Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office, or LDRRMO. It is under in the Section 12 PDRRM Act. It is established in every province, city, municipality, and barangay disaster risk reduction and management committee in every barangay. Its responsibility is to set in the direction, development, implementation, and coordination of disaster risk management program within their territorial jurisdiction. The LDRRMO shall be under in the office of the governor, city or municipal mayor, and the barangay captain in case of BDRRMC. The LDRRMO is initially organized and it is composed of DRRMO, which is assisted by the 3 staff which is responsible for the administrative and training, research and planning, and operation and warning. The LDRRMOs and the BDRRMCs shall organize, train, and directly supervise the local emergency response teams and the accredited community disaster volunteer, or ACDV. Let's proceed to the accreditation, mobilization, and protection and disaster volunteers, and the National Service Reserve Corps, civil society organization, and the private sector. It is under in the Section 13 PDRRM Act. The government agencies, CSOs, private sector, and LGUs may mobilize individuals or organize volunteers to augment their respective personnel complement and logistical requirements in the delivery of disaster risk reduction programs and activities. The agencies, CSOs, private sector, and LGUs concerned shall take full responsibility for the enhancement, welfare, and protection of the volunteer and shall submit the list of volunteers to the OCD through the LDRRMOs for accreditation and inclusion in the database of community disaster volunteers. Next, the integration of DRRM education into the school curricula and Sangguniang Kabataan, or SK program and mandatory training for the public sector employees, which is under in the Section 14 PDRRM Act. The DepEd, CHED, TESDA, in coordination with the OCD, NYC, DOST, DENR, DILG, BFP, DOH, DSWD, and other relevant agency shall integrate the DRRM education in the school curricula of secondary and tertiary levels of education, including the Nstp, whether private or public, including the formal and non-formal, technical vocational, indigenous learning, and out-of-school youth courses. And last, programs. The NDRRMC, RDRRMCs, LDRRMCs, LDRRMOs, BDRRMCs, and the SK Councils shall encourage community, specifically the youth participation in DRRM activities.
talk about disaster risk reduction and management concepts. The concept of disaster risk reduction and management, or the Ccdrdm, accepts that some hazard events may occur but tries to lessen the impact by improving the community's ability to absorb the impact with minimum damage or destruction. Disaster risk reduction and management is a series of actions, or programs, projects, and/or measures and instruments expressly aimed to reducing disaster risk in endangered regions and mitigating the extent of disasters. Operationally, it includes risk assessment, disaster prevention, and mitigation and disaster preparedness. It is used to underscore the current trend of taking a proactive approach to hazards posed by extreme natural phenomena. Definition of disaster management terms. First, let's define what is a disaster. Disaster is a situation or event which overwhelms local capacity, necessitating a request to national or international level for external assistance, and unforeseen and often sudden event that causes great damage, destruction, and human suffering. Number 1. Hazards. A situation that poses a level of threat to life, health, property, or environment. Number 2 is risk. A probability or threat if a damage, injury, loss, or other negative occurrence that is caused by external or internal vulnerabilities, and that may be neutralized through preemptive action. Vulnerability. The level of susceptibility or resiliency of the people and communities against the impact of the prevailing hazards, based on the stats of physical, social, and economic conditions in given area. Refers to disasters. A serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society, involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses of impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. The disaster equation. Hazards or H. Physical impact of disturbance. Risk or R. Likelihood of harm, loss, disaster. People or community or the exposure. Elements affected by hazard. Vulnerability or letter V. Susceptibility and capacity to prepare, absorb, and recover from hazard. H times R plus V is equal to disaster, where disaster risk reduction and management, or DRRM, includes administrative decisions and operational activities that involve prevention, or the concerns acting before something happens so to prevent from occurring and to avoid its effects. 2 is the mitigation, minimizing the effects of disaster. For example, building, codes and zoning, vulnerability analysis, and public education. Number 3 is the preparedness, planning how to respond. Examples: preparedness plans, emergency exercises or training, and warning systems. Next, the response, efforts to minimize the hazards created by a disaster. Example, search and rescue and emergency relief. Next is the recovery, returning the community to normal campus, temporary housing, grants, and medical care. Disaster risk management involves all levels of government, decision makers, and local government. Non-governmental and community-based organization plays a vital role in the process. Communities themselves are the first responders. Disaster risk management cycle. First, the prevention. It is the actions undertaken in advance. Sometimes this is referred to as mitigation. Prevention, or the actions undertaken in advance. Sometimes this is referred to as mitigation. Examples include backburning or constructing seawalls to protect from tidal waves, having alternative sources of electricity or alternative communication systems in place. Prevention activities should be happening all the time. Mitigation, or efforts attempt to prevent hazards from developing into disasters altogether, or to reduce the effects of disaster when they occur. The mitigation phase differs from the other phases because it focuses on long-term measures. For reducing or eliminating risk, personal mitigation is mainly about knowing and avoiding unnecessary risk. This includes an assessment of possible risk to personal or family health and to personally property. An example of personal non-structural mitigation would be to avoid buying property that is exposed to hazard. Example, in a floodplain, in areas of subsidence or landslides. In the preparedness phase, emergency managers develop plans of action for the disaster strikes. Common preparedness measures include the communication plans with easily understood terminology and chain of command, proper maintenance and training of emergency services, development and exercise of emergency population warning methods combined with emergency shelters and evacuation plans. Response. The response phase includes the mobilization of the necessary emergency services and first responders in the disaster area. This is likely to include a first wave of core emergency services such as firefighters, police, and ambulance crews. They may be supported by a number of secondary emergency services such as specialist rescue teams. Recovery. The aim of the recovery phase is to restore the affected area to its previous state. It differs from the response phase in its focus. Recovery efforts are concerned with issues and decisions that must be made after immediate needs are addressed. Recovery efforts are primarily concerned with actions that involve rebuilding destroyed property, reemployment, and the repair of other essential infrastructure. Rehabilitation or the reconstruction phase. It aims to restore the communities to the pre-earthquake status. During this phase, the social and other infrastructure is restored and economy revitalized. The rehabilitation or reconstruction phase typically starts at the end of relief phase and may last for several years. The short-term plans of the recovery process are clearance of debris, building housing units, restoration of the lifelines and infrastructures, while the long-term objective is to build a safer and sustainable livelihood. Past experiences shows that the efforts are sustainable only with community or government partnership, while NGOs and international organizations' role is reduced after a certain period. Disaster management refers to the efficient and effective utilization of resources and the application of measures that will mitigate the impact of unfortunate events and facilitate return to normalcy and development. 1. Disaster management occurs before, during, and after a disaster. Number 2. Disaster management consists of the DRM component as well as relief, response, early and long-term recovery, including rehabilitation and reconstruction. Letter A. Disaster response, including relief activities, is conducted immediately after a disaster occurs, primarily to save lives and for humanitarian purposes. B. Recovery occurs over the short, medium, and long term in the aftermath of disaster. Rehabilitation and reconstruction, on the other hand, are long-term activities necessary to restore public infrastructures, services, and critical facilities. Building back better during this process means not generating new risk and mitigating existing ones.
Hello everyone, good morning, and I am Inajoy Laureta from DSIT1F, your reporter for today's discussion. But before we proceed, I want you to let you know everyone that beyond the time, everything can be possible happen. Our topic for today is all about CDMF, known as Comprehensive Disaster Management Framework. Comprehensive Disaster management framework encompasses disaster risk reduction, mitigation, and preparedness in the prevent, and disaster response, rehabilitation, and recovery in the past event. CDMF, a framework that has evolved and adapted the lessons of the past disaster events as well as emerging concerns, and embarked on the National Authorities Program TRASAIM to among others. It implements the Hugo Framework for Action 2005 to 2015, building the resilience of nations and communities to disasters with the 5 thematic areas or priorities for action. And now, as we proceed from the 5 thematic areas or priorities for action as follows by 1. Governance, which ensure that disaster risk reduction is a national and local priority with a strong institutional basis for implementation. 2. Risk assessment and early warning. Identify, assess, and monitor disaster risk and enhance early warning. For the third one, knowledge management and education. Use knowledge, innovation, and education to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels. For the fourth one, risk management and vulnerability reduction. Reduce the underlying factors. And for the last one, disaster preparedness. Strengthen disaster preparedness for effective response at all levels. Now, let's move on from infomercial of awareness and preparedness from disaster.
Right back with you after these short commercials.
Nagbagsakan ng ilang puno at sanga sa gitna ng daan sa Baguio City.
Dumami pa ang mga lugar na nasa ilalim ng signal number 1.
Patuloy na nararamdaman yung malakas na
I'm going to present topic 3. The Philippine Risk Profile and Disaster Management Trends, Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management. The Philippine Archipelago occupies the western ring of the Pacific Ocean, or or the western segment of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a most active part of the Earth that is characterized by an oceans encircling belt of active volcanoes and earthquake generators. Sakop ng Pilipinas ang Western Pacific Ocean o ang tinatawag nating the Pacific Ring of Fire. Geologic hazards. July 16, 1990, intensity and earthquake. 1,666 persons dead, 3,500 persons are injured, and 11 billion cost of damage property, 1.2 billion cost of damage in agriculture, June 1991. Mount Pinatubo eruption, the biggest volcanic eruption of the century, 800 persons dead, 10.6 billion cost of damage, 3 comprehensive disaster risk management. Naitala dito ang bilang ng mga namatay at mga nasugatan, kasama na rin ang iba't ibang sektor ng agrikultura. Hydrometeorological hazards. The Philippines experiences an average of 20 tropical cyclones a year, 5 of which can be destructive. The December 2004 landslide in the provinces of Quezon and Aurora were a result of continuous rainfall in the area. Naitala dito ang isang uri ng sakuna na nararanasan ng Pilipinas gaya ng tropical cyclone at ang landslide na natamo ng probinsya ng Quezon at Aurora na resulta ng tuloy-tuloy na pag-ulan. Weather system affecting the Philippines. Tropical cyclones, seasonal monsoons, southwest, June to September, northeast, November to March, cold front, intertropical convergence zone, easterly trade, thunderstorms, comprehensive disaster risk management. Category of tropical cyclones. Category strengths, tropical depression 65 km per hour. Tropical cyclone 66 to 119 km per hour. Typhoon 120 km per hour or more 6. Losses due disaster in the 20th century. Hazard event number of persons killed, damage. Typhoon, earthquake, volcano, flood. Disaster management trends up to the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s to 2000. 2000 presents 8 disaster response, disaster preparedness, and response, natural disaster reduction, disaster preparedness, and response disasters, and development natural disaster risk. Lastly, the need of paradigm shift. The need for paradigm shift of our disaster management approaches and strategies from reactive to proactive disasters, nature, environment, human actions, decrease vulnerability. That's all.
Hazard in the Philippines. The Philippines is prone to various natural hazards because of its geographic and geologic settings. Hazard classification. Number 1. Natural hazard are natural process of phenomena occurring in the biosphere that may constitute a damaging event. A. Geographic hazard. Natural earth processes or phenomena in the biosphere which include geological, neotectonic, geophysical, geomorphological, and hydrogeological nature. B. Hydrometeorological hazard. Natural processes or phenomena of atmosphere hydrological, oceanographical nature. C. Biological hazard. Processes of organic or those converged by biological vectors, including exposure to pathogenic microorganism, toxin. Example, outbreak of academic disease, plants or animals contagious and extensive infestation. 2. Technological hazard. Danger organization from technological or industrial academics, dangerous procedure infrastructure, culture or certain human activity, which may cause by loss of life or injury, property damage, social and economic degradation. Example, A. Industrial pollution, nuclear activity, and radioactivity. B. Toxic waste, dam feature, transport, industrial or technological accident. 3. Environmental degradation processes induced by human behavior and activities that damage the nature in source base of eventually alter natural processes or ecosystems. B. Land, water, air pollution, climate change, sea level rise, ozone depletion. The Philippines Hazard Scope. RP is the static hydrometeorological hazard. The Philippines is vulnerable to almost all types of nature hazard because of its geographical location. Liquefaction affects sand, oil, subsidence.
Geographical hazards and disaster risk profiles of the Philippines. The Philippines, by virtue of its geographic circumstances, is highly prone to natural disasters such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tropical cyclones, and floods, making it one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. The Disaster Risk Profile Report of the Philippines seeks to document the impacts of natural disasters on the social and economic development of the Philippines, assess the country's capacity to reduce and manage disaster risk, and identify options for more effective management of that risk. The framework should incorporate the essential steps of integrated risk management, which include risk identification, risk reduction, and risk sharing or financing. The study identified some specific areas under these key themes that would need to be addressed to improve the current system discussed through the study. The study also found that currently the government and individual households bear the majority of cost by natural disasters. More effective options for financing disaster risk and relieving the burden of disasters from the public sector should be explored, including the idea of a catastrophe insurance pool and or contingent credit facilities. 5. The country has also its episodes of human-made disasters such as urban fires, air, land, and sea mishaps, and complex emergency, mostly in southern Philippines because of the secessionist movement, coupled with its vulnerability to floods and other natural hazards. In risk profile and disaster management trends, comprehensive disaster risk management framework module 2. Philippines application session module 2. Philippines application session 1. Number 1. The Philippine archipelago occupies the western ring of the Pacific Ocean or western segment of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a most active part of the Earth that is characterized by an ocean encircling belt of active volcanoes and earthquake generators or faults. Number 2. Geologic hazards. July 16, 1990. Intensity 8 earthquake, 1,666 persons dead, 3,500 persons injured, 11 billion pesos cost of damaged property, 1.2 billion cost of damage in agriculture. June 1991. Mount Pinatubo eruption. The biggest volcanic eruption of the century, 800 persons dead, 10.6 billion pesos cost of damages. Trip Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Framework Module 2, Philippines Application. Number 3. Hydrometeorological hazards. The Philippines experiences an average of 20 tropical cyclones a year, 5 of which can be destructive. The December 2004 landslides in the provinces of Quezon and Aurora were a result of the continuous rainfall in the Area 4 Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Framework Module 2. Philippines Application. Number 4. Weather system affecting the Philippines: tropical cyclones, seasonal monsoons, southwest June to September, northeast November to March, cold front, intertropical convergence zone, easterly trade, thunderstorms. 5. Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Framework Module 2. Philippines Application. Number 5. Category of tropical cyclones: category strength, tropical depression 35 to 65 km per hour, tropical cyclone 66 to 119 km per hour, typhoon 120 kph or more. 6. Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Framework Module 2. Philippines Application. Due to disasters in the 20th century: hazard event, number of persons killed, damage, US dollar. Typhoon, earthquake, volcano, flood. Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Framework Module 2. Philippines Application. Number 7. Disaster Management Trends up to the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000 to 2000 and present. 8. Disaster Response, Disaster Preparedness and Response, Natural Disaster Reduction, Disaster Preparedness and Response, Disasters and Development, Natural Disaster Risk Reduction, Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Framework Module 2. Philippines Application. Number 8. The need for a paradigm shift of our disaster management approaches and strategies from reactive to proactive. Disaster nature, environment, human actions. Increase, decrease, vulnerability to natural hazards.
Philippine Disaster Risk Profile. The Philippines is vulnerable to almost all types of natural hazards because of its geographical location. Number 1. Located within the circum-Pacific belt of fires and along typhoon path, the Philippines becomes exposed to natural perils like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, typhoons, and their resultant effects like tsunami, landslides, floods, and flash floods. Number 2. As an archipelago with 7,641 islands, the threat of tsunami affecting the country's coastal areas is not far-fetched. Number 3. The Moro Gulf earthquake with 7.6 intensity triggers a tsunami which affected southern Philippines and resulted to the death of around 3,800 persons and destruction of properties. Number 4. Yearly, the country experiences an average of 20 typhoons. Half of these are destructive. Is a host to 220 volcanoes, 22 of which are active, as well as active faults and trenches that are potential sources of earthquakes. And number 5. The country has also its episodes of human-made disasters such as urban fires, air, land, and sea mishaps, and complex emergency, mostly in southern Philippines because of secessionist movement, coupled with its vulnerability to floods and other natural hazards.
We'll be right back with you after these short commercials.
Smart Sound.
Magandang araw sa ating lahat. Minsan ba naisip nyo kung paano natin maiiwasan ang pagkalunod o paano natin maililigtas ang mga nalulunod sa kasagsagan ng baha? Well, here are some tips for you. Just watch till the end. Enjoy watching!
kapag wala kang magamit na bangka, pangligtas ng kapwa sa kasagsagan ng baha, maaari mong magamit itong lubid upang panghila sa mga tao na tinangay ng baha.
The vulnerability of the urban environment. Vulnerability perspective in disasters, which is rapidly emerging as a dominant view in the field, assumes that a real disaster occurs when it strikes an underprivileged population. Vulnerability is formally defined as the characteristics of a person or group and their situations that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural hazard. Implicit here is differential vulnerability. That is, different populations face different levels of risk and vulnerability. Consequently, policies aimed to addressing risk and vulnerability must also take into account these differential impacts and outcomes of disasters, although the sources of vulnerability are multiple and quite diverse. Some of the most important factors that affect vulnerability include population growth and distribution and social diversity. Several elements contribute to urban vulnerability. It is their compounding and correlated effects that make urban disaster risk reduction a challenge. From the word vulnerability, it is a state of being exposed to possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. In having a population growth, it is a very challenging part for them to reduce the risk. This explains how do they react on different risks like floods, typhoon, earthquake, and other disaster. Like for example, how does the people of Tacloban recover from the super typhoon that named Yolanda? Imagine, their populations are increasing every year. How can they cope with each other? Another example is discipline of people in urban government. Because some are prohibitors, some people are the rule breaker. They take advantage of the nature so that in that case, the disaster occurs. There are elements of vulnerability attributes. It can be grouped into the following. First is unplanned urbanization. Is having increasingly devastating effects. Rapidly exploding growth of cities is overwhelming government institutions with the pressure of urbanization. Much of the growth is haphazard, far exceeding the city's capacity to adequately plan and control development. As a result, uncontrolled urbanization often feeds the growth of slums, reinforces poverty, and diminishes cities' ability to deal with disasters. Faced with these challenges, cities develop housing infrastructures and offered basic social services haphazardly and often without any formal land use and urban planning process. When these elements exist, they are typically oriented towards optimization of land and seldom incorporate and disaster risk management parameters. Migration aggravates the problem by creating large-scale, informal construction. Migrants also face insignificant challenges in adapting their past experience and coping strategies to the new risk environment in cities. The urbanization, it is the process through which cities grow and higher percentage of the population comes to live in the city. For example, in Manila, there are so many infrastructures and there are lots of people in that place. Unlike here in our province, there are lots of trees, fresh air, and no poor infrastructures. Another example for this is the Pabahay project by the government. They must think of the nature when planning an infrastructure for the people. Due to the typhoons, there are uncertain decisions made by the institutions. If it is an unplanned, it will cause risks such as the air pollution because of the high population. In order for them to reduce this risk, they must plan good structures, infrastructures, building, and etc. to prevent unhealthy settlement. The second elements of vulnerability attributes is continuing social and physical degradation. New migrants and the underprivileged move into inner city neighborhoods where buildings are old and in poor maintenance conditions. Access roads are narrow and service delivery is difficult. These old buildings and the aging infrastructures pose a constant threat to their occupants from hazards such as fires, floods, and earthquakes. A significant proportion of urban dwellers resides and works in these highly vulnerable buildings where they are at high risk from multiple hazards and where access for emergency vehicles is often difficult can be completely obstructed by building debris in case of a hazard event. Solutions to reduce social and physical vulnerabilities are socially, politically, and financially difficult to devise and implement. Reducing the social and physical vulnerability of this neighborhood remains a formidable challenge to the authorities. There are countries social in the world experiencing this continuing social and physical degradation. Usually this occurs when there are calamities in a certain localities such as earthquakes, floods, armed conflicts, fires, and others that force them to move places where they deem safe for them. However, the haven's physical facilities as well as social services makes their life risky due to unsafe buildings, unsafe roads that would not make immediate access to social services. Relocation to a better world is now a big challenge to the government, a better and safety place for constituents to live in physically and socially. Let's hope and pray that this problem can be resolved.
Ang panganib sa lungsod ay napabayaan dahil ang mga lokal na otoridad ay hindi nila pinapansin ang malaking panganib at ang pamahalaan ay pinabayaan ang organisasyon dahil sa pagtatakda ng DRR at pagbibigay pondo suporta ayon sa pagkakabanggit. Gayunpaman, dumarami na ang patungkol sa kahinaan ng paaralan at ospital at kung ano pa. Ang mga isinagawang instruktura ay isang malaking panganib sa mga tao, bagkos hindi ito matibay kapag may dumating na sakuna. So, dumako naman tayo sa climate change. Climate change is pagbabago ng temperatura. Alam nyo ba, ang pagtaas ng temperatura ay nakakapinsala dahil maaari itong magdulot ng biglaang pagbago ng panahon. Tulad ng pag-ulan ng malakas at El Nino at kung ano pa. Dahil dito maraming maapektuhan. Disaster risk reduction is ito ay pagbawas ng panganib sa sakuna. Sa pamamagitan ng HFA ay isang pangunahing diskarte para sa pagbago ng klima. Ang pagbabawas ng panganib ay hindi nila ang isaalang-alang climate change. Gayunpaman, kailan nila ang pagsisikap upang mabuo ang konseptong ito. Weak institutional arrangements. Sa karamihan ng pagbuo ng mga bansa, batas at institutional na kaayusan inihibit sa halip pagganahin ang mga lokal na aksyon, habang ito ay kumikilala na kalamidad ay unang lokal na mga kaganapan o pananagutan. Ang otoridad at ang mga pagkukunan ay hindi sapat upang pagganahin ang lokal na pamahalaan. Upang ipalagay ang pagmamayari at kumikilos upang pamahalaan ang epektibong pagbisa ng kalamidad.
The number 7 in the vulnerability of urban environment. Lack of political feasibility, politicians, administrators, and community leaders all face conflicting priorities, and DRR almost invariably take the backseat to other needs which may be considered more pressing or easier to solve. Risk is not managed preemptively, but thought of in terms of something to be dealt with the disaster strike through emergency response and humanitarian assistance. Further, the inadequacy of experience, methodology, and standard for benchmarking make DRR an attractive proposition for local officials. It says here, when we say political feasibility, it refers to the contents that either make an agreement on policies difficult in the first place or limit or prohibit the effective implementation of agreed policies. Because the politicians and other administrations are all facing conflicts, DRR is the one who is providing human assistance. Risk is not something that they impose precautions or measures. Instead, they think of ways and measures when the disaster has already arrived. That make all the standard and the methodologies they are using become unattractive to people. The number 8. Insufficient knowledge, experience, and capacity disaster risk reduction is complex and few administrators have experience implementing DRR initiatives. It takes time, effort, tools, and training to assimilate disaster risk reduction in city functions and ongoing operations. Significant deficiencies remain throughout cities and megacities in terms of interinstitutional coordinations, warning systems, incident command and control resources for response, relief, recovery, and rehabilitation practice. and additional weaknesses relate to the project planning processes of government. While concepts are often understood and policies are in place, carrying these policies and concepts to practice is a major hurdle for government at all levels. Even among cities which have shown completely in establishing planning processes to control physical development. Carrying these planning processes into project, planning and execution remains a challenging step. It says here that the disaster risk reduction is a tool wherein help all the national policies in planning and managing risks, but it is complex to implement once you have insufficient knowledge, experience, and capacity to administer it because it needs time to assimilate all the plans that need to accomplish for the better operations of national policies, so that every operations will accomplish easily but still take the accept that disaster risk reduction remains a challenging step as well in every institutional. The number 9. Lack of acceptable standards of practice. DRM is a professional practice that still lacks its own set of acceptable standards of practice. This results in a dispersion of efforts and ineffective uses of resources. It also the political support for local level action on DRR, providing tools to enable translation national policies into mainstreaming planning processes at the local level would help cities in understanding the options that are available to them for managing risk and for planning the implementing urban DRR. Hence, the way forward to create a safer world are, it says here first that the digital right management is the important tools in technological because it can protect you in the safetyness of your own world. It can eradicate in copying your works that are being posted in technological resources. It is your own protection in your own work. No one can thief it. The first type of safer world is the recognizing that the environmental sustainability is a must for stopping a disaster. It says that the environmental sustainability will be the key to stop disaster because it knows how to avoid degradation of natural resources, especially in agricultural department. The letter B is recognizing the social sustainability along with the development is necessary for good risk reduction. It says here that social sustainability is the least key in surviving different ways, but along with the development, it is good for risk reduction. And the other type is recognizing the information as a form of disaster response in its own right. It says the information was so important in every learnings because this is the tool to make a moral way to know what is the right, especially in government development. It will take to a good disaster response. And the fourth type is the supporting better access to information and communications along with the technology for vulnerable communities. It says that having a technology in communicating other person will make easily understand each other. It will avoid the carrier breakdown or the vulnerable communities since better access will provide better informations. And the fifth types is the building a partnership for sharing information with the communities, local governments, media, telephones, and companies and industries. When you're making a communications to someone, you will build the partnership, means you will share your thoughts to each other using the cell phones. For example, in a business, one of batchmate chatting you that he or she wants to build a business, which is internet cafe, then you realize that it is a common business. But your kinship, their own skills, you are likely able to accept her request, then partnership are built. And for the last types, women and men of all ages from disaster-affected areas and wider local populations, including vulnerable groups, should receive information about the assistance program and are given the opportunity to comment to the assistance agency during all stages. Because of technological resources, every woman and men of all ages are having used it for them to know the information that they are all acknowledging to receive their assistance program.